So friends, our gospel this morning is from Matthew chapter 7, 24 to 29. As I said, it's the last passage in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And here Jesus, he offers this parable that we just reviewed with Leander. But here he's offering a suggestion to kind of look back. And he's saying that people who are wise build this foundation of rock, but what it involves is hearing what Jesus has said and then acting upon it. So that this sermon somehow transforms your life. That's the wise person. So I invite you to listen for God's word speaking to you. Jesus said, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Now, when Jesus had finished saying these words, the crowds were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes." Friends, this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So not too long after we bought our place in Canada, this is over 25 years ago, we learned that the front of the cottage sits on sinking sand. And we first noticed this when the front door wouldn't close anymore. And my first solution to this was just to trim off the bottom of the door. And then I trimmed it off again, and I trimmed it off again, and I thought, this isn't going to work, right? So pretty soon we figured out that the whole front was sinking. And one summer when I crawled under there to investigate, I found that the whole front of the cottage was just supported on one large cedar log that was just sitting on some random rocks they had found when they built it, and that whole log was rotting away. So I replaced that log with some treated timber. I set these kind of timbers on cinder blocks and sent the cinder blocks on 2 by 2 foot concrete pads, thinking, that's not going to sink. But as I was leveling up the whole front, I noticed that as I was kind of jacking up the house, even those 2 foot pads just started sinking into this kind of silty, muddy ground. And so now pretty much every summer I have to crawl under the house and jack up the front of the cottage. And over the years, I've used all sorts of scrap pieces of wood to fill in that space. And it's pretty comical looking now. It's sort of like something Dr. Seuss would build, just all kind of teetering over. Last summer, Deb and I asked a young friend of ours to take a look under the house. She's some kind of architectural engineer. And she said, you really should just tear the whole place down and rebuild it on a good foundation. And I said, Jesus. No, that's exactly what Jesus said. The wise man built his house on a rock. Wouldn't that be nice? A house on a rock, right? And the foolish man built his house upon sand, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on those houses, and the house on the sand fell, and great was its fall. So this turns out to be really good building advice Jesus is giving us. But notice this. It's not the storm that matters. In this passage, the storm is described in exactly the same way. So the storms of life are exactly the same. We can't change them. What matters is the foundation. What's our foundation like? So, of course, Jesus wasn't only giving building advice. He was giving us spiritual advice. And essentially what he's doing here is asking, what is the foundation of your life? What are you building your life on? Is it something temporary, like sand? Or is it something more permanent, maybe even more eternal? But the truth is, I think most of us, especially in this country, are tempted to make some temporary things part of our life foundation. And so one way to gauge if you've done this is simply to pay attention to your relationship with temporary things in your life. So what is your mental, emotional reaction when you lose something temporary? Is it, oh, things come and go, I'm fine? Or is it panic? Are you filled with anxiety? So here are a few of the temporary things we are taught to build our lives upon. I think the most common is probably money, right? So in our culture, money equals security. Money is your foundation. So as you know, I'm nearing retirement. And for the last couple of years, I've been bombarded with advertisements designed to make me afraid that I will run out of money. I don't know about you, but I've been invited to dozens of steak dinners where people are going to show me the way. If I just turn my money over to the right company, I will be secure. So the myth is the more money you have, the happier you will be. But just hang out with some wealthy people and you'll realize that mostly is not the case. Money does not equal happiness. Here's the thing. People who give away their money are way happier than people who hang on to it for dear life. So earlier in this sermon, Jesus says, do not store up treasures on earth. And he's not trying to be mean to us. He's just saying if you depend on your treasure for your happiness, you're going to be disappointed. So another common foundation of our life is our reputation. We want to be held in high esteem. But you may have noticed that in today's psalm that Mary read for us, both those of low estate and those of high estate are said to be less than a breath. And I love the image. They just go up in a scale. No matter how much esteem you get, you're going up in the scale. You're less than a breath. So I remember a couple of years ago, a friend was telling us about a funeral she went to for one of her colleagues. And this man had been an accomplished academic. And during the funeral, his life story was recounted, like often happens in funerals. And she heard of all his accomplishments, the books he'd written, the papers he'd written, his many awards. But what struck everyone about his life is that he was really kind to stray cats. He was always looking out for stray cats, and he always had cat food on hand to feed them. So I don't want to give away the end of my sermon, but with this kindness to stray cats, we're approaching something more eternal, right? So kindness is one of the fruits of the Spirit. And, whenever you accomplish something, it feels good for a while. So there's a certain amount of fame if you write a book. But that's sort of temporary. But your acts of kindness, well, those can be eternal. Those are what people are going to remember you for. Here's another kind of sand. Maybe you've noticed this these days. That there are people who cannot rest, who will not rest until Donald Trump is no longer president. Do you know those people? I might be one of those people. I'm trying not to be. So as long as this administration is in power, they refuse to be at peace. So another common foundation for our happiness is the state of our country or the state of our world. And of course, there's nothing wrong with loving your country. There's nothing wrong with being concerned about this world we live in, right? If you truly love your country, you should really do everything you can to make it more good, more just, more loving. But countries are temporary. Just ask the Roman Empire about that, right? They rise and they fall. And if you attach your happiness to one country, or if you attach your happiness to one political party being in power, you will be disappointed most of your life. So I read a column yesterday morning in the Washington Post, and it just happened to be the final column written by this man who's been reporting on the U.S. Congress for almost 20 years. He's moving on to something else. And his outlook about Congress was bleak. So he said both the House and the Senate are losing power. People are resigning from their positions as representatives and senators because they just can't stand the partisan bickering anymore. Public confidence in these institutions is now at an all-time low. So what if the House and the Senate just collapsed and we lost that balance of power? Would that make you anxious? What if the course we are on as a nation led to the fall of the United States of America? Does that thought fill you with dread? Now consider this. The earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Modern humans have been around for about 300,000 years, and the United States is a mere 250 years old. A breath. Dust. So if we cling to any nation as our foundation, we're building on sinking sand. Okay, one more. So another common foundation for happiness in life is to get married and have children. Of course, that's not the path for everyone, right? But that's what we're taught. Get married and have children. And then children and then grandchildren become the main source of your joy. But children are also temporary, aren't they? And even after they're fully grown, they are constantly changing. So, of course, there's nothing wrong with loving your children or your grandchildren, but parents need to be extremely cautious here. So the question is, are you in love with your child, or are you in love with your role as a parent? So this happened to me earlier this week. I was reaching into our silverware drawer for a fork, and I pulled out this tiny little child-sized fork. It was one our daughters used over 25 years ago. And when I realized what I had in my hand, there was something almost like a pain in my chest, and I gasped. And it was a sort of grieving that they aren't those little girls anymore, that they aren't living under our roof. And I realized that part of me wants our daughters to be those little girls again. That is really dangerous if you're not careful and examining that. So there's nothing wrong with having fond memories of your children's childhood. But if you're not careful, you might find yourself resenting that they grow up, that they no longer need you in the same way, that they don't need you to feed them and house them and clothe them and tuck them in at night. They don't need you to give them money. They don't need your advice anymore. I don't have this written down, but it just reminded me of this. So about 3 years ago, our daughter Isabel, our oldest, who's like 31, said to me, Dad, I really like our relationship now because I feel like we're more like friends than we have been. So I just want you to know I never listened to any of your advice. I'm like, okay. So they don't need your advice. And so the role of being a parent is just that. It's a role you play for a season. It's temporary. It's always evolving. It's like shifting sand in that way. And if you try to make that role permanent, you will make both your children and yourself miserable. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Why don't you ever call me? Why don't you ever listen to me? Why don't you ever take my advice? Why don't you come visit more often? So these are the questions of people who have gotten caught up in needing the temporary role of being a parent. And when you do that, you risk missing the love that exists between a parent and child eternally. You miss out on that eternal love that's always there. So Jesus advises that we build our lives on rock and not on sinking sand. So who is it that he says builds on the rock? Well, it's people who hear what he said and act upon it. In short, anyone who lives by this Sermon on the Mount, acts on it, has built their foundation on rock. So let's review what we find in this sermon. It begins, blessed are people of virtue. Not rich people, not powerful people, people of virtue. Peacemakers, the merciful, the humble. We're told we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. We don't have to do anything to earn that. That's who we are already from when we were born. We're taught not to defend our cheek or our coat or our time or our money. We're taught to let go of our wealth. We're taught to let go of the need to have enemies. We're taught that God's light shines on both the good and the evil. And that's what perfection is all about. And we need to be perfect like God is perfect. We're taught to let go of the need for others to constantly praise us. We're taught to pray in this way, God, your will, not mine, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So by the way, did you see what James Tallarico said the other day about the Lord's Prayer? Made me so jealous, I have to say. Now, he is a Presbyterian, our brand. He is a seminarian. I'm not sure the state of his education, but I thought he got a good education. This is brilliant. Anyway, this is what he said. He said, Jesus said to us, on earth as it is in heaven. And then he asks, can we imagine war in heaven? Can we imagine bigotry in heaven? Can we imagine poverty in heaven? Then why do we tolerate these things on earth? Wow, think about that whenever we say on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus taught us in this sermon, if you are anxious, meditate on flowers. Here's the thing about flowers. They're here today and they're gone tomorrow, like all of us, and yet they bring joy and happiness into the world. And finally, Jesus says, in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. Everyone who hears these words, all of this, everyone who hears these words and acts on them will be like a wise person who built their house on the rock. So what this amounts to, I think, is really lessening our dependence on this material world and embracing things like love and joy and peace. So St. Augustine put it this way: love and do what you will. Love and do what you will. And by that, I believe what he meant was love God, love neighbor, love enemies, love every last thing about this life, and then act accordingly. Love and act accordingly. Let love be the foundation of your life, and you can't go wrong.